It also has the passive effect on the field where the player with the lowest life points no longer takes damage. So, why is this card banned? Well, it's that draw one effect. Occasionally, there's cards on the ban list with a whole bunch of different effects, and it's only one of their effects that puts them on the ban list, which is definitely the case for Chicken Game. If it didn't have the effect to draw one card, it probably wouldn't be banned. Now, here's what's so great about this card. If you activate this card and then use the effect, you get to draw one card which immediately replaces the Chicken Game you just put on the field, which allows you to go hand neutral and card advantage. There is currently a limited card in the game called Upstart Goblin, which also allows you to go hand neutral by drawing one card and giving your opponent 1000 life points. And that card is so good it's currently limited to one copy, because it essentially allows you to play a smaller deck, since you can always activate the card to replace it for another one from your deck, which just increases the consistency of basically any deck that it's in. Chicken Game is a little bit better than Upstart Goblin, because it can search out of the deck with a plethora of field spell card support, which allows you to thin your deck even more and then play Chicken Game. There's also another field spell card called Pseudospace, which allows you to copy the effects of a field spell card in your graveyard for a turn. Oh, and also, Chicken Game only has a soft once per turn for its effect, which means if you get other copies of the card, you can also use their effects on the same turn. So with 3 terraformings and 3 pseudospaces, you essentially play with 9 less cards in your deck if you played Chicken Game, which just added a whole bunch of consistency to any deck that tried to use the engine, as long as they didn't mind paying a whole bunch of life points to do so. There was also an FTK with Chicken Game with all the draw power, where you would just use Life Equalizer and Magical Explosion in order to beat your opponent as soon as their turn started. So, can Chicken Game be unbanned? The answer is maybe. Currently, the card is not banned in the OCG, and only sees a moderate amount of play, if any at all. And part of the reason is because the OCG put restrictions on terraforming and Metaverse pretty quickly, whereas Chicken Game was banned before either of those cards were restricted on the ban list in the TCG. So without good ways to search the card out, it's not as hyper consistent as it was in the past. And since the TCG also has terraforming limited now, they could probably safely unban the card, if even only to one copy. This card is definitely one of the tamest cards on the ban list. Update. All of this is still true, however, now we also have Rainbow Bridge of Salvation as an additional way to search the card, turning Foolish Burial Goods into more copies of Terraform. However, the power creep of the game has gotten to the point where this kind of investment for a draw one isn't that big of a deal, so I wouldn't be surprised if this card was unbanned in TCG someday without an errata. And at number 2 on this list, we have Mirage of Nightmare. This is a continuous spell card which has the effect that only activates during your opponent's standby phase, where you draw cards until you have 4 cards in your hand. Then, during your next standby phase, you have to randomly discard the same number of cards from your hand that you drew, or your entire hand if you have less. So essentially, this card would allow you to dump your entire hand during your turn, like what most combo decks do anyway, then draw 4 cards as soon as your opponent's turn started, which could mean getting 4 hand traps and allowing you to stop your opponent from doing anything. One of the more popular ways to use this card when it was still available to play was to simply destroy the card before your standby phase started. That way you got to keep the 4 cards in your hand. In the modern game of Yu-Gi-Oh!, drawing 4 cards is kind of ridiculously good. Let me tell you about 3 other cards that exist in the game. Pot of Desires, Pot of Extravagance, and Card D. Pot of Desires requires you to banish 1/4 of your deck face down in order to draw 2 cards. Pot of Extravagance requires you to banish almost half of your extra deck face down in order to draw 2 cards, which also locks you out of other draw effects for the rest of the turn. Card D cannot be special summoned, blocks you from special summoning other monsters, requires the card to tribute itself and only during the turn that it was normal summoned, in which case it immediately ends your turn and then allows you to draw 2 cards. All 3 of these cards share the common theme of being able to draw 2 cards, and all 3 of them have heavy restrictions for drawing those 2 cards, and all 3 of them have seen competitive play, and consistent competitive play throughout all the years at that. The downsides of Mirage of Nightmare are not even that bad. Even if you don't bypass the effect, you can just refill your hand after dumping everything on your first turn, maybe draw a few hand traps to block your opponent. And there are so many different ways to get rid of Mirage of Nightmare before your turn starts nowadays that if you wanted to go around the side effects, you could do it pretty easily. In fact, you could probably get around the side effects while gaining advantage in some decks. So, can Mirage of Nightmare be unbanned? The answer is definitely no. The card was strong in the early days of the game when you couldn't really bypass the effect very easily, and would be kind of straight broken in the modern metagame. where there is a plethora of ways to bypass the side effects, or not even care, since the side effects could be a benefit for some decks. The random discard also counts as a discard effect, so that would activate the effects of Dark Worlds and Dangers. How can the card be fixed to be unbanned? The only way would be to errata the card, and the best way to do that would probably to put some Sandian-like restrictions on the cards drawn, where you can't use them during the turn that they're added to your hand. And then take a page from some of the pendulum effects, where the downsides still happen even if the card leaves the field. And of course, banish the cards face down instead of sending them to the graveyard. This would keep the effect of being able to draw 4 cards, but actually give it harsh restrictions, where you would probably still see competitive play. Update. This card is still bonkers. They've released even more graveyard effects and cards that like to be discarded since I made the video originally 3 years ago. It seems as if this card gets stronger and stronger as time goes on, especially since it lets you potentially draw into hand traps on your opponent's turn. Next up, we have Card of Safe Return. This card is another continuous spell, which has a very simple effect that if a monster is special summoned from your graveyard, you can draw 1 card. There are quite a few decks that can special summon from the graveyard very easily, and even a couple that do it infinitely through some loops. So that card can essentially allow you to draw every single card in your deck in 1 turn, or just gain a ridiculous amount of advantage for combo decks. And funny enough, this card didn't actually see play when it first came out, and it was an even weaker version than its anime counterpart, which allowed you to draw 3 cards when a monster was summoned. Although, like I explained in the chicken game segment, being able to draw 1 card is already pretty good. Not having a limit on it is broken. So, can Card of Safe Return be unbanned? The answer is also definitely no. The card is more broken than Mirage of Nightmare, as it allows you to gain the advantage immediately during your turn without having to wait for your opponent's turn. It would just add a level of consistency to combo decks that would be way too strong for the game. How can the card be fixed to be unbanned? This one's pretty easy, just slap a hard once per turn on the effect. You already have cards like Supply Squad that allow you to draw 1 card per turn if a monster you control is destroyed. The activation requirement for that one is not even that much harder than Card of Safe Return, and it doesn't really see that much play. And at number 4 on this list, we have Graceful Charity. This card allows you to draw 3 cards, then discard 2. Unlike Card of Safe Return, this card basically saw play from the beginning, and it didn't really stop seeing play until it got banned, where it was then unbanned for 1 format and then banned again forever in 2007. Out of all the cards that allow you to draw, just in general, Graceful Charity is probably the single strongest without setup, and it technically doesn't give you card advantage, as you just go hand neutral with its effect, similar to Upstart Goblin. The thing with Graceful Charity is it allows you to dig through your deck to get your combo pieces, and then selectively set up your graveyard with any 2 cards from your hand while not losing any advantage in that exchange. It's also a discard effect, so it activates the effect of Dark World monsters and other cards that require specifically to be discarded. And with how prevalent graveyard effects are in the game, with a lot of decks using their graveyard as a second hand, this would just allow you to basically go +3 with its card advantage, instead of the hand neutral like it's intended. And an effortless +3 for a majority of decks is pretty good, especially since people jump through hoops to play cards like Pot of Extravagance, which is only a +1. Can Graceful Charity be unbanned? This is another hard no. It would probably be an auto-include in just about every deck, and allow already good meta decks to be even better without effort. At least there's some counterplay involved with the previous 3 cards, and even a little bit of setup required in order to use them to their broken effects. But not with Graceful Charity. It's just good right out the gate, and is even better in good decks. So how could the card be fixed to be unbanned? This one's pretty difficult. I can't think of a good way to adjust this card while keeping true to the intended effect, other than just adding a whole bunch of restrictions to it like the Pot of Greed retrains. Although I don't think that's a very creative way of fixing the effect, but it's just so inherently good that it's kind of hard to allow it to exist without slapping a whole bunch of restrictions onto this imagined card. Next up on this list, we have Pot of Greed. This card was banned because no one could figure out what it actually does, and was voted as the #1 most confusing card in the game in the 2008 World Championship. But in order to summarize this card's effect, basically it lets you draw 2 cards without any restrictions. Pot of Desires and Pot of Extravagance are basically 2 ways of Konami trying to fix this card, by just creating more balanced versions of it, where they basically did what I suggested for fixing Graceful Charity, just slap a whole bunch of restrictions on it. And also hard once per turns, because the ability to draw 2 cards without any restrictions is literally good in every single deck. Remember, there's a card that's currently limited to 1 copy on the ban list called Sekka's Light, which allows you to draw 2 cards, but only if you have no spell or traps in your graveyard, and also locks you out of using any other spell or traps for the rest of the duel. And also is a hard once per turn. In addition, it has a really good graveyard effect of Mulligan, but the fact that a card that literally stops you from using any other spell or traps is considered so good that it's currently limited to 1 copy should tell you something about an unrestricted version of Pot of Greed. So, can Pot of Greed be unbanned? Not at all. There's already too many cards in the game that exist which try to fix its effect, which also see heavy competitive play. So, releasing the granddaddy of them all wouldn't really make sense unless they did it for fun, because they wanted everyone to enjoy 1 copy of Pot of Greed in their deck for a format or something. How could the card be fixed to be unbanned? Honestly, I don't think they would, because Pot of Greed has so many retrains. And generally, retrains are Konami's way of trying to fix previously broken cards without having to change the original. I can't think of any card that has had more retrains than Pot of Greed, so I think it's just kind of stuck in ban list purgatory forever. Update. They had no ban list tournaments in Japan where people weren't really using Pot of Greed at all, because that saw the deck was better spent on a hand trap to stop their opponent's insane turn 1 combos. Which means, in a future where combo decks are so fast, Pot of Greed might be unbannable because its advantage is just too slow to wait to use during your turn. But as it is now, it's still very good to be honest, and its lesser de-evolution versions see immense amount of competitive play still. And for the 6th card on this list, we have the Delinquent Duo. This card has the simple effect where you can pay 1,000 life points to discard 2 cards from your opponent's hand, one of them at random and the other one of their choice. Technically, this card allows you to go +1 in card advantage, similar to Pot of Greed, although it does require you to pay 1,000 life points, and that +1 alone would probably get the card banned, but that's only half of the problem of this card. If there was a card in the game that only traded 1 for 1 instead of 2 for 1, and only let you go hand neutral, that would be an excellent trade-off. Out of all the ways to go 1 for 1, doing it effortlessly by discarding from your opponent's hand is one of the strongest 1 for 1 trades you can make in the game, because of the potential to loop those effects in order to get rid of your opponent's entire hand before they have a chance to play the game. That's why there's so many heavy restrictions and limitations to cards that allow you to discard from your opponent's hand, where they usually require you to go -1 in those exchanges at the very least, because that does a much better job of balancing it out. And so Delinquent Duo allowed you to go +1 is one of the best ways you can possibly exchange card advantage, which means it's incredibly strong and was part of one of the very first meta decks in the game, which did not rely on just summoning a strong monster to beat down your opponent. This version actually relied more on just getting rid of your opponent's cards in their hand, while also having a few strong monsters that actually deal damage to their opponent, and getting rid of more cards from the hand with cards like Don Zalude. So, can Delinquent Duo be unbanned? No, of course not. It's ridiculously powerful. Not even for fun like they could with Pot of Greed, since that card just adds more consistency to decks. Delinquent Duo would be kind of unfair to whoever went second. How can they fix the card to be unbanned? Even if you added on a cost to also discard from your hand in order to use it, it would still be strong. This one's also kind of tough like Graceful Charity, because the effect itself is inherently strong even if you only use it once per turn. Although I would definitely slap a hard once per turn on it anyway, although I can't think of good ways to really restrict this card without just slapping a whole bunch of restrictions to it, like after they use it, no special summons, or not using any other spell or traps for the rest of the turn, or etc, etc. Update. There's actually a lot of discussion in the community about whether a random discard 2 is even useful anymore, since it's only useful going first. And since you don't get to pick the cards, you don't gain any hand knowledge to play around hand traps. Although personally, I'd argue that while some meta decks could probably play through 2 random cards getting discarded, it would still be killer to meta decks that actually need to use cards from their hand and not from the graveyard, and this is still a complete blowout to rogue decks. Plus, it's not useless going second either, like most people will argue. People still have hand traps in their hand even after an established board of monsters most of the time. Next up on this list, we have the Forceful Sentry. This card has the effect where it simply lets you look at your opponent's hand and then send any one card from your opponent's hand back into their deck. And this card is probably stronger than Delinquent Duo, surprising enough. considering it actually gets rid of one less card. The difference between these two cards is that the Forceful Sentry lets you pick whichever card you want to send back from your opponent's hand, which gives you knowledge on your opponent's hand and allows you to play around whatever they might have left, while also getting rid of whatever their best combo piece is or whatever their most dangerous hand trap is that might stop you from doing your plays. There exists a card in the game called 3 Tactical Talents, which can only be used during your turn when your opponent activates a monster effect during your turn. So it's kind of hard to activate, and what it does is when you use it, it lets you choose one of 3 effects, and the effect chosen the most out of those 3 is basically the one that lets you use Forceful Sentry's effect. The other 2 effects are also good. One of them is literally just Pot of Greed, and the other one is Change of Heart. Both of those are excellent effects to pick as well. It's just the Forceful Sentry is picked the most because it allows you to get rid of your opponent's other hand trap, and gaining information on what their plan is so that you can play around them and know which hand trap to use yourself. And just all kinds of information that's super valuable in competitive decks. And since it sends the card back to the deck, you don't have to worry about setting up their graveyard like you would if you discarded it like with Delinquent Duo. It's still super valuable to trade 1 for 1 from your opponent's hand, but the Forceful Sentry does it in probably the best possible way. It's straight up a 1 for 1 exchange, you don't gain card advantage, but it's so strong that the effect is literally chosen over 2 other very strong effects that do give you card advantage. So, could the Forceful Sentry be unbanned? This is another hard no, considering the card is probably better than Delinquent Duo. The ability to gain information on your opponent's hand and also control that hand at the same time while not losing any advantage is ridiculously good. Out of all the cards in the game that technically only trade 1 for 1, Forceful Sentry is probably the best. How could the card be fixed to be unbanned? Honestly, they kind of already did it with 3 Tactical Talents. Just put crazy restrictions on the effect, and even then, it's still really strong. This is another one where a hard once per turn wouldn't really solve the issue, since there exists a hard once per turn version of this card in the game that does already see competitive success. And it's also kind of like Pot of Greed, where they already kind of have a retrain of the card, so they wouldn't really need to bother with fixing the card in order to unban it. And at number 8 in this video, we have Confiscation. This card is like the Forceful Sentry. It lets you look at your opponent's hand, but it discards the card you pick instead of sending it back to the deck, and requires you to pay 1,000 life points to use it. And even though it's technically not as good as Forceful Sentry, and was the last of the 3 discard cards to be banned, it's also still incredibly powerful and would absolutely see play in pretty much every meta deck if it was live. So could Confiscation be unbanned? Same as Forceful Sentry? Probably not. They've already introduced an incredibly nerfed version of this card as well, called a Pointer of the Red Lotus, which only gets rid of a card for 1 turn, is a trap card which is inherently slower than a spell card, and requires you to pay 2 times the amount of life points, and it sees all kind of competitive success. So obviously the better version would be too powerful for the current metagame. Maybe we'll get to a point where graveyard effects are just better than hand effects, to the point where getting your hand discarded isn't a big deal anymore, in which case it might come off the ban list. How could the card be fixed to be unbanned? Well, they already kind of fixed it with the Pointer of the Red Lotus. Slow it down by making it a trap, making them only lose the card temporarily, and of course requiring a harsher life point cost. Update: a Pointer of the Red Lotus is now limited to 1 copy because it was too good, further cementing how good Confiscation would still be in today's meta. Next up in this video, we have Snatch Steal. This is an equipped spell card which has the effect to take control of whichever monster your opponent controls that you equip it to, with the downside that during each of your opponent's standby phases, they gain 1,000 life points. Now, giving your opponent life points isn't really a downside most of the time. It's almost laughably bad as a detriment to a card, since life points don't really matter very much, and it's such a minor amount to give to your opponent for how powerful the effect is. Inherently, the ability to take control of one of your opponent's monsters is a +1 in card advantage, since you're simultaneously denying your opponent a card and gaining a new card at the same time. And Snatch Steal doesn't really require you to lose any kind of advantage to accomplish this feat. There's also no limitations on the monster you can steal, which makes it additionally a very powerful form of removal, since it technically doesn't destroy or banish. It's able to steal a lot of monsters that usually would have protection. Although since the card does target, it needs to be equipped. There is some counterplay where they could just chain MST to the activation of Snatch Steal in order to stop it. Or if the card has an effect that prevents targeting, like Fantastical Dragon Phantasme, you'll be able to stop it with those cards. However, also because it's an equipped spell card, it enjoys a massive amount of very good support. The card could be searched out from the deck directly with Armory Call or Hidden Armory, and it could be recycled endlessly with Gear Breed. Equipped spell cards enjoy a lot of really good support because they are inherently kind of bad, and they can receive this good support because cards like Snatch Steal are banned, so they don't have to worry too much about it. So, could Snatch Steal be unbanned? Funny thing is, they did unban it for a single format. Konami was trying this thing where they were unbanning choice cards for one format just to allow players to play some of these long-standing banned cards. And Snatch Steal was one of those very few cards that was unbanned in this process before they abandoned the idea. And in that one format, literally every single deck played the card, and it was absolutely meta-defining and could single-handedly win you some games. It was almost hilarious how good it was, even at a time when Dragon Rulers were still running about. There's even better equipped spell card support today, to the point where cards like Smoke Grenade of the Thief is considered a broken card, where in the past it was considered a joke. So I think the card would probably perform even better today. How could the card be fixed to be unbanned? The thing is, there already are some equipped spell cards that allow you to steal your opponent's monsters, and they're not considered broken. Most of them rely on another card being on the field as well, like Comic Hand or Falling Down. Those ones have additional counterplay since your opponent can remove the other cards in the field, which render their effects no longer working. Snatch Steal isn't really part of an archetype though, so that kind of fix wouldn't really work with it. If they wanted to unban Snatch Steal, they would probably have to give it an actual cost to its negative effect, like requiring the person who uses it to pay half your life points during each of the standby phase, and also ban Hidden Armory, Armory Call, and Gear Breed. Although even if you ban those three cards, Infernobles would probably still be able to use it pretty easily, and you can't really ban an entire archetype. Well, they can. They did do that with the Dragon Rulers, but they probably don't want to do that again just to unban one singular equipped spell card. All that being said, I'm not 100% confident that they wouldn't just unban the card without a change, because it would just be a strong staple like Super Polymerization. And there's so many strong staples in the game right now that it would just kind of fit in with the rest of them if it was simply given an actual cost or downside, since it's currently an effortless +1. And last up on this first episode of all of the banned spell cards, we have Change of Heart. This is another spell card which allows you to take control of a monster that is banned, and is definitely the premier strongest of all of them. It allows you to take control of any monster without restrictions, just like Snatch Steal, although it doesn't have counterplay potential of them being able to chain an MST to stop the effect. So it's strictly a stronger effect, since just like Snatch Steal, it allows you to go +1 with its ability to control one of your opponent's monsters. And it's a very powerful form of removal that has very few counters. Basically, anything that can remove a monster without destroying it, banishing it, or targeting is pretty good. Change of Heart does target at the very least, so there are some cards which can be immune to the effect. And Change of Heart is the original card that allows you to steal one of your opponent's monsters. And it has such a simple effect that it's super powerful, where it would definitely see all kinds of play, considering Mind Control is an extremely limited version of Change of Heart and sees a healthy amount of competitive success, even though it has a whole bunch of limitations on the cards you can steal for a time. So, could Change of Heart be unbanned? Probably. Like I said with Snatch Steal, it would just be a very powerful staple that would kind of fit in with a whole bunch of other powerful staples. The card wouldn't have that much benefit over a card like Mind Control, since it would basically just be taking the card for one turn and using the stolen card in the exact same ways people use Mind Control today. Except for the fact that you could also attack with the monster or tribute it. If it were to be released, it would have to be the one copy, just like Mind Control, but even then I could still definitely still see it being a little bit too strong, because generally they don't like effortless +1s in the game, and this is definitely an effortless +1 since it currently doesn't have any restrictions. How could the card be fixed to be unbanned? Honestly, they kind of already did this with Brain Control, which was another Mind Control-like card that was also banned, and it was only a slightly more restrictive Change of Heart, since it simply required you to pay life points in order to steal a monster. And all they did to Brain Control was give it a simple errata where they gave it an actual restriction to the target they could take control of, where you can only take control of a monster that can be normal summoned or set, which means you can't use it to steal extra deck monsters. If they simply gave Change of Heart the same restriction, then they could easily take it off the ban list and no one would play it. If they required you to discard one card in order to use it, it would no longer be a +1 and still be a form of removal, but one which is kind of dubious if it would see play or not. This one seems like it'd be pretty easy to fix, since they already had success in the past with similar cards in the form of Brain Control, although they overcorrected with that card and now it doesn't see any play. Update: this car is now limited in the TCG and semi-limited in Master Duel. And while it does see some competitive play, it's not the powerhouse card to be afraid of, and it's not even omnipresent in every deck. First up on this list, we have the counter to Dragon Ruler's Spellbook of Judgment. If you watch my video on why main deck monsters are banned part 1, you'd see that half the Dragon Ruler archetype is currently banned, and that's because they were incredibly powerful and one of the strongest archetypes in the game's history. And even with all the advantages Dragon Rulers had, they never made Tier 0 status because of Spellbook of Judgment coming out at the same time. A single card that's able to hold back an entire powerful archetype is an excellent card to start off a video on singular powerful cards. So what does Spellbook of Judgment do? Well, during the end phase of the turn this card is activated, you get to add Spellbook spell cards from your deck to your hand, up to the number of spell cards you activated this turn, after using Spellbook of Judgment. So you'd want to use Spellbook of Judgment immediately, then start using as many spell cards as possible, which do not need to be Spellbook spell cards, as any spell card counted towards its effect. Then you could special summon any one spellcaster type monster from your deck who had a level less than or equal to the number of spell cards added to your hand by its effect. And also, this card had a hard once per turn. So if you played this card correctly, it would allow you to go +7 in card advantage during your end phase, and generally, a card is considered incredibly good if it allows you to go +1. So this is a little bit stronger than that by a smidge. Although gaining a whole bunch of advantage doesn't mean anything if you can't use those cards, as technically Oja Magic allows you to go +2 with its effect, and that one doesn't see any play because the cards that it lets you add to your hand aren't good. Well, spellbooks actually have two pretty good targets. One of them is their field spell card, the Grand Spellbook Tower. This card allows you to draw one extra card every turn as long as you return one spellbook spell card from your graveyard to your deck. And it floats into the special summon of a spellcaster type monster from your deck on its destruction. With the Grand Spellbook Tower, you essentially got to draw 2 cards every turn, once during your draw phase and another during your standby phase, which is pretty good for a field spell card. Although it's pretty easy to search out field spell cards, that's not really the power card of spellbooks. It was definitely Spellbook of Fate. This is a quick play spell card that allows you to banish a number of spellbook spell cards from your graveyard in order to activate one of its 3 effects. If you banish 3 for its best effect, you got to banish 1 card in the field without targeting it. And non-target banishing is incredibly good. But it also has the option to have a Book of Moon effect that could double a Squibble monster face up as well. Or if you only banished 1 spell card, you could return one of your opponent's set spell or traps from their hand, which wasn't as useful. Spellbook of Fate was definitely the power card for being able to non-target banish one of your opponent's cards. Then there was a whole bunch of other mediocre Spellbook spell cards which aren't super good on their own, but if you're able to use them without worrying about losing advantage, then they actually get kind of bumped up in usefulness a little bit. Spellbook of Wisdom allowed you to protect your spellcasters from spell or trap effects. Spellbook of Secrets was a great card to copy the effect of in order to search out your other spellbooks thanks to cards like Spellbook of the Master. And there was even a spellbook card that allows you to special summon spellcasters from the graveyard, Spellbook of Life. Although while the spellbook cards were fine and everything, the real power of Spellbook of Judgment was the ability to special summon that monster from your deck. The absolute best target to choose was Jiaojin the Spiritualist. This is a level 3 spellcaster type monster which prevents both players from special summoning monsters when on the field, and allows you to destroy all special summon monsters in the field if you use its effect to discard a card from your hand. And preventing your opponent from special summoning is super good. Most decks are trying to special summon as much as possible in order to do their thing. So they have to try and destroy Jiaojin before they can do any of their combos, where you can then just control them with your set spell cards, i.e. Spellbook of Fate. So with Spellbook of Judgment, which was incredibly easy to search out in that deck I might add, thanks to cards like Spellbook of Secrets and Spellbook Magician of Prophecy, you were basically incentivized to play all the cards in your hand without needing to conserve anything, because you would just get it all back anyway and then some. The amount of advantage the one card generated was just too strong, which is why the card was banned shortly after it came out in September of 2015. Can Spellbook of Judgment be unbanned 7 years after it came out? Probably still no. While it is true most of the Spellbook cards have been power prepped already, there is a variant of Spellbooks that does see some niche competitive success even today, making use of a more control-oriented strategy with cards like Mystic Mind combined with Jiaojin the Spiritualist. They also released a new Spellbook spell card called Spellbook of Knowledge, which adds a little bit more consistency to the Spellbook engines, or just any deck that uses spellcaster-type monsters. And there's a lot of good spellcaster-type monsters in the game. The fact is, Spellbook of Judgment just allows you to gain too much advantage on its own, and even though most of the cards you can search out aren't as powerful anymore, it doesn't really matter if it's so many of them. How could the card be fixed to be unbanned? If they just straight up remove the ability to special summon a monster from the deck, it might be okay at that point. It would still give you a whole bunch of advantage, sure, but it would be during the end phase and it wouldn't really be any hand traps that could be used immediately anyway. And it's real easy to beat someone in one turn nowadays, especially if you know they don't really have any hand traps in their hand. But the ability to bring out Joujin is what was really increasing the power level of Spellbook of Judgment. Alternatively, they could fix the card by just banning Jiaojun the Spiritualist, although the ability to special summon a monster from the deck is still super strong, especially when it's such a variety of levels that eventually they would just find a new second best target to pick anyway. Although Konami isn't super keen on just removing effects from cards when they are out of them, so a more reasonable suggestion would be to probably just heavily restrict the monster you do bring out from the deck, or find some way to limit the amount of cards you can add to your hand, like maybe requiring you to discard all cards from your hand that aren't Spellbook spell cards as well, so you couldn't keep any of your hand traps. So you'd still gain a whole bunch of advantage from the card, but at least it would have some weaknesses and you'd be left vulnerable to your opponent's plays and attacks. And of course there's the inherent weakness where Spellbook of Judgment can kinda just be stopped with a single hand trap anyway, which wasn't really a thing when the card came out, but just because a card can be stopped by a hand trap doesn't make the card bad. Nowadays, this card is still a strong card, but the rest of the Spellbook archetype has aged horribly in comparison with it. Though spell-heavy decks like Runic and Striker could play this card to get Jiaojin at the end of their turn, it probably won't amount to anything more than a gimmick. Update. Turns out, power creep is crazy. Spellbook of Judgment is now like Ojin Magic in that it gives you a bunch of advantage that doesn't do enough anymore. Being able to bring out Jiaojin is still good, but not good enough to muck up your deck with Spellbook cards to search out Judgment, especially since they banned Mystic Mind too. Next up in this video, we have Mass Driver. Mass Driver is a continuous spell card which simply has the effect that you contribute one monster to your side of the field in order to inflict 400 points of damage to your opponent's life points. With the rules of the game only allowing you to normal summon one monster per turn, this card is inherently balanced by the fact that you should only be able to use the effect once per turn. And kind of bad at that, since 400 life points is only 5% of your opponent's starting life points. You have to use the effect 20 times in order for it to win the duel. Although I'm sure the intended use of the card was to be used during the main phase too, in order to tribute all of your monsters in order to finish off your opponent with that last bit of effect damage, or to be used in swarm decks that can bring out a whole bunch of small monsters in order to maybe tribute them or something, I don't know. What the card was actually used for was first turn kill strategies. You see, in 2010, a second wave of Frog support came out, which included two Toad cards, called Substitoad and Ronin Totem. Substitoad allowed you to tribute one monster in order to special summon one frog monster from your deck. Ronin Totem allowed you to banish a frog monster from your graveyard in order to special summon itself from the graveyard. Neither of these cards have a once per turn on their effects. So what they would do is bring out Substitoad as soon as possible, and then just use its effect 20 times in order to get 20 frogs in the graveyard as well as Ronin Totem. Then use Ronin Totem's effect 20 times in combination with Mass Driver, where they would bring out Ronin Totem, have it tributed for 400 life points of damage, and then just repeat until your opponent's life points reach 0. And this FDK was so consistent and easy to pull off, especially in an era before widespread use of hand traps, that it actually won the World Championship in 2010. So shortly afterwards, they banned Substitoad almost immediately after the event so that frogs could fill the graveyard with 20 frogs in a turn. And then a year later, in March of 2011, they banned Mass Driver as well, since it allowed these kinds of combos to be a little bit too easy to pull off. Here's the thing though, Mass Driver is not the only card in the game with an effect like this. There's actually a series of monster cards that can kind of do the same thing, where they let you tribute a monster in order to inflict damage to your opponent without having once per turns on their effects. The reason Mass Driver got banned over all these monsters though, is because it's easier to get a spell card on the field than a monster, even if the spell card inflicts slightly less damage. Cannon Soldier inflicts 500 damage each time it uses its effect, although it's at 3 copies right now and unlimited, while Mass Driver is banned. And Mass Driver inflicts 100 less life points for the same effect and cost. Although honestly, all of the Cannon Soldier-like cards should be banned too, because they have been used in FTKs over the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! As well. Which is why they are banned in the OCG, just not in the TCG yet. And part of the reason the 100 less life points thing doesn't matter for Mass Driver is because you're only ever using the effect with basically an infinite amount of cards anyway, or with so many like Substitoad that it doesn't happen. Can Mass Driver be unbanned? Probably not, unless Konami is very smart about never introducing loops to the game that allow you to tribute an ungodly amount of monsters per turn, which, after the fiasco with Fireball Dragon, is probably asking a little bit too much from them. Because sometimes they'll accidentally print cards that can just kind of allow you to infinitely loop with Cannon Soldier-like cards, and Mass Driver would give those loots a lot more consistency, since they wouldn't have to spend resources trying to get a monster on the field in addition to pulling off that loop. How can Mass Driver be fixed to be unbanned? Simply give the card a once per turn on its effect. It doesn't even need a hard once per turn, just any kind of once per turn would fix the card, since it's only broken when used an infinite amount of times, or 20 times at least in the case of Substitoad. Or if it limited the card to only be usable 10 times per turn, that would probably work too. Although generally, the highest a card goes to when it comes to the limited amount of times per turn is 3. So if it was limited to 3 times per turn, that would solve the problem as well. Just as long as you can't use the card 20 times in a turn, it's not really broken, and kind of mediocre even. This is an excellent case of how a lack of a once per turn completely destroys the card and makes it overpowered. And at number 3, we have Last Will. This is a spell card which allows you to special summon a monster from your deck, just as long as it has less than 1500 attack, and you send a monster from your side of the field to the graveyard this turn. This card is not once per turn, but that's not why this card is currently banned. Like I mentioned with Spellbook of Judgment, being able to special summon a monster from the deck is incredibly powerful, and this card is super versatile with its target. It allows you to bring out Jiaojin the Spiritualist as well. And here's the thing about Last Will. This card kinda came out in the early days of the game, so its wording is a little bit unconventional. And because of its unconventional wording, you can technically special summon the monster with this card's effect whenever you want during your turn, just as long as it's at a spell speed 1. Which means you can technically activate the effect during your end phase in order to bring out Jiaojin the Spiritualist, exactly like with Spellbook of Judgment. Of course, it's a lot more useful if you use the effect during your main phase to bring out other cards. In the early days of the game, Last Will was used to bring out Magical Scientists in order to facilitate its FTK strategy with Catapult Turtle, as it could bring out either of those two combo pieces depending on which one you didn't draw into. Although Magical Scientist was banned as it was considered the problem part of that combo, because in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh! It wasn't super useful to bring out low attack monsters from your deck outside of the lone Magical Scientist. It wasn't until we got better low attack monsters like Rescue Cat that the problems of this card started to become more apparent. The card was definitely not future-proofed and was already a problem even when there were so few targets for it. Nowadays, there are tons and tons of really good monsters with less than 1500 attack, and the card that eventually got Last Will banned was Rescue Cat, because that card allowed you to special summon 2 other cards from the deck, so if you had Rescue Cat in your starting hand, you could use its effect to send itself to the graveyard to special summon 2 beasts from your deck. That would activate the conditions for Last Will, which would allow you to bring out another Rescue Cat and then get 2 more cards on the field. So a Rescue Cat in the hand as well as Last Will allowed you to end on a board of 4 monsters in the field directly from the deck, which was kind of a big deal in the early days of the game, especially when Synchro Monsters came out. Although Last Will got banned before Synchro Monsters ever got a chance to come out, as Last Will was banned in March of 2007, about a year before the first Synchro Monsters released. If Last Will existed in the game today, it's kind of guaranteed that it would be played in pretty much every single deck, as there aren't a lot of decks that do not have monsters of less than 1500 attack that they would love to special summon to the field. It's one of those cases where it seems like an incredibly simple effect, but is actually kind of overpowered in the right circumstances, and those circumstances are super easy to fulfill in a whole bunch of different kinds of decks. Can Last Will be unbanned? No, not at all. We still have cards like 1-for-1 limited on the ban list, which only allows you to special summon a level 1 monster from the deck, and requires you to actually discard a card in order to use it. A level 1 monster is way more limited than Last Will, and 1-for-1 is definitely considered a good card, which has basically seen competitive play ever since it came out. Last Will is just too much of a power card to be unbanned in the current format, and it just gets better and better as more cards are released. It also has that weird wording that allows you to special summon the monster whenever you want, which would allow you to do it during the battle phase as well. Although like I said a little bit earlier, it's much more useful if you just use it during your main phase like normal anyway. How can the card be fixed to be unbanned? First off, probably fix the wording on the effect to limit it only during the main phases. That way it doesn't cause any rulings confusions. After that, have the card negate the effects of the monster that it brings out, including negating the effects of that monster's name for the rest of the turn, similar to cards like Peaceful Burial. where you can't activate the cards that share that card's name for the rest of the turn that you send to the graveyard. This would go a long way to fixing the card's problem of bringing out power cards that allow you to gain immediate advantage from them, like Rescue Cat or Magical Scientist. If you can't use those effects when brought out immediately, then there's a good chance they won't survive to the next turn anyway. There's also a lot of cards that would gain advantage when they're used as materials or sent to the graveyard, so this would be a catch-all in order to make sure those effects don't happen either. It would probably still be useful in some decks that just want cards in the graveyard but don't particularly need them right away, and would kinda stay true to the original effect. And also, give the card a hard once per turn, because currently it doesn't have one. It would still be kind of good getting 3 monsters out from your deck with this card without a meaningful cost, since sending a monster from your field to the graveyard is super easy nowadays, and that used to be a little bit more difficult in the early days of the game. Alright, next up we have Painful Choice. This is a spell card that allows you to select 5 cards from your deck, then show them to your opponent. Your opponent gets to select one of those cards and add to your hand, while the other 4 get sent to the graveyard. Everything about this card is just pure advantage. The intended use of this card was to maybe get one useful card from your deck, while you had the negative effect of sending the rest of them to the graveyard where you wouldn't be able to use them again. However, with how many decks use the graveyard as a resource, and the amount of cards that gain advantage while in the graveyard, Painful Choice just kinda becomes a +4 in card advantage. As the card itself is hand neutral already, you get to add a card to your deck for playing 1 card from your hand. And then the 4 cards in the graveyard could all have graveyard effects that allow you to gain advantage from them as well. There's lots of cards in the game that give you advantage from the graveyard, like Metal Foes Fusion, Destiny Hero Malicious, Destiny Hero Celestial, Heroic Challenger Thousand Blades, Perform Mage Trick Clown, World Chalice Guard Dragon, the entire Phantom Knights archetype, most of the Burning Abyss cards, the Dragon Rulers, Orcus, Zombies, and so on and so on. You get the picture. There's lots of cards that love to be in the graveyard from many different archetypes. Even in the early days of the game when graveyard effects were rare, this card was used in Exodia decks in order to send all the pieces to the graveyard in order to add them back with cards like Backup Soldier. There's also cards like Chaos decks or Thunder Dragons that like to put cards in the graveyard to be used later on as a resource, in order to potentially gain advantage. Painful Choice was eventually banned in April of 2005. Can Painful Choice be unbanned? No, it's like a Foolish Burial on steroids, and Foolish Burial is still limited to 1 copy, is really good, and only allows you to send 1 card from your deck to the graveyard with no other kinds of benefits. There's also lots of strategies that only work when they're able to set up the graveyard, which Painful Choice would make way better. How can the card be fixed to be unbanned? Currently, the big problem of this card is sending those cards to the graveyard, where even if they had effects like Peaceful Burial, where you couldn't use the card effects this turn, it would still be too good as a setup tool. So instead, I would probably take a page out of Pot of Desires, where the actual painful choice of the card is that the other 4 cards that aren't picked get banished face down. The card would still be good to allow you to add a card from your deck to your hand without a real cost, but at least you wouldn't be able to gain advantage from the other 4 cards as well. Banishing cards face down is kind of an actual real cost nowadays, even if there are ways to make use of those kinds of cards as well. And lastly, we have That Grass Looks Greener, a more powerful version of Painful Choice. Now, what this card does is if you have more cards in your deck than your opponent does, you get to send a number of cards to the top of your deck to the graveyard until you both control the same number of cards in your deck. So the way to make the most use of this card was to simply play a 60-card deck. In Yu-Gi-Oh!, or at least in a competitive environment, the optimal amount of cards to have in your deck is exactly 40, because you want your deck to be as consistent as possible, and the best way to increase your consistency is to play the minimum amount of cards. You just have a higher chance of drawing the cards you need if you have less cards to pick through. So if you played a 60-card deck, which was the maximum deck size when the card came out, That Grass Looks Greener would allow you to mill at least 20 cards from the top of your deck. And if you remember from the Painful Choice segment, there's a lot of cards that allow you to gain advantage from the graveyard, and also a lot of cards that can use the graveyard as a resource to gain advantage. So literally what some decks would do is just play a combination of Lightsworn, Zombies, Plants, and Dinosaurs, as well as a whole bunch of other staple graveyard cards, in order to just gain a ridiculous amount of advantage from a single resolution of That Grass Looks Greener. If you were really lucky, you could go plus 20 off of its effect. Although that was like a super best case scenario in a gimmicky deck and wasn't what happened. Realistically, you go something like plus 5 or plus 10 off of the effect, which is still ridiculously good. The amount of advantage That Grass Looks Greener gave you was basically a 1-card win. as it was actual good advantage too that could be used during your turn, unlike Spellbook of Judgment where all the advantage was only during the end phase. And most of the advantage that card gives you has been kind of power crept by now. Resolving Grass was so much advantage in those kinds of decks that those decks were also happily playing 3 copies of Left Arm Offering, which was a spell card that required you to banish your entire hand as long as you had 2 or more other cards in your hand in order to add 1 spell card from your deck to your hand, but also had the restriction that you could not set other spell or trap cards during this turn. And Left Arm Offering was supposed to be a huge detriment in order to search out 1 spell card, but that 1 spell card was so good that it was absolutely worth the insane cost to activate the effect. And since that Grass Looks Greener was so successful at being a huge power card, that other decks in the meta that weren't even playing Grass started using 60 card decks just to counter this 1 card. Because if your opponent had 60 cards in the deck as well, then you couldn't actually get any mill off of that Grass Looks Greener, unless they performed a whole bunch of searches during their turn or something. And if a single card in the metagame was causing other people to start to suboptimally build their decks just to counter it, you know you kind of have a strong card in the game. So the card was eventually banned in May of 2018, and no one was really surprised by that. Funny enough, this card was actually added to Duel Links as well, where the maximum deck size in the game is 30, and the minimum is 20. So the most you could mill is 10 cards with the average stack for the event. And eventually, that game got to the point where they had enough graveyard effects, where that Grass Looks Greener was one of the first ever banned cards in Duel Links, alongside Cyberstein. So, even in an incredibly restricted format with way less cards in the deck, it was still too good. So, can that Grass Looks Greener be unbanned? No. In the video that's grouping all of the singular most powerful spells, obviously none of these are going to get a yes. It's basically a better Painful Choice and has the potential to give you some of the most amount of advantage without looping or infinite combos out of basically any card in the game. Although it's easily countered by mirror matches and other people who decide to play 60 card decks. Having to play a 60 card deck in order to counter 1 card in the game isn't really a healthy game state. How can the card be fixed to be unbanned? I have no idea. Being able to mill half of an average deck with 1 card is kind of strong. And the whole point of the card is to mill those cards to the graveyard. So having the card banish them face down, for example, wouldn't really make sense as a fix with sticking to the theme of the card. Even if you gave it a Peaceful Burial-like effect so the cards can't be used that turn, it would still provide a lot of resources in the graveyard to be used later on. Although that would probably go a long way to limiting the potential of the card, and make it so Left Arm Offering wasn't a be-all, end-all searched out, since it would leave you basically with nothing for a turn. Although if they were to make 1 fix to the card, giving it a Peaceful Burial-like restriction would kind of go a long way to giving it some counterplay at the very least, even if it's not really enough to fix exactly what's wrong with the card. This is a card that just kind of needs to stay banned, unless they make some kind of ruling in the future where graveyards aren't as valuable as they are today. Update: the card is still very good and ban-worthy, though I'd like to make a note that it's not a better Painful Choice. While it's true you could potentially go plus 20 with Grass, it requires you to play unruly deck full of cards only usable in the graveyard, and hoping your opponent doesn't match Boss of Grass or Left Arm Offering. While Painful Choice can just be played in a normal 40 card more consistent deck, and play much less, but still good, graveyard effects. So while the potential highs of Grass are bigger in theory, in practice, Painful Choice is the much more superior card of the two. First up, we have Heavy Storm. This is a spell card which simply has the effect to destroy all spell and trap cards on the field. Currently, we have a card that's limited to 1 copy called Harpy's Feather Duster, which allows you to destroy all of your opponent's spell and trap cards without a cost. We also have cards like Lightning Storm, where if you control no cards, it allows you to destroy all your opponent's spell and trap cards. And Lightning Storm is currently unrestricted on the ban list. So why do we have 2 cards which can destroy all of your opponent's spell and trap cards unbanned, when we have a card like Heavy Storm which can do the same thing but also destroys your own spell and trap cards still being banned? Well, on surface level, Heavy Storm definitely seems like a worse version of Harpy's Feather Duster or Lightning Storm. And historically, that has always been kinda true. That's why Heavy Storm was banned way later than Harpy's Feather Duster, not hitting the ban list until September 2013. But the reason Harpy's Feather Duster was released off the ban list before Heavy Storm is because the metagame has kind of shifted to a point where there's a lot more spell and trap cards that have good floating effects now, where that wasn't really the case back in the day outside of Gear Town shenanigans. And also the ever-rising popularity of the Floodgate. There are currently 2 really powerful Floodgates that are banned, called Vanity's Emptiness and Royal Oppression. where they both basically allow you to prevent your opponent from summoning monsters. And the reason those two cards were banned was because they were too easy to remove during your own turn in order to just kind of ignore their downsides, where they were supposed to floodgate both players, not just your opponent. So Heavy Storm would allow you to simultaneously remove your floodgates that you only activate during your opponent's turn and clear out your opponent's back row at the same time, whereas Harpy's Feather Duster only allows you to clear out your opponent's back row. Now, being able to clear out your opponent's back row without much of a cost is incredibly powerful. Just look at Twin Twisters. It allows you to destroy 2 cards but requires a discard cost and still sees heavy competitive play. So the effect is good. It's just the dual nature of being able to get rid of your own floodgates or activate your floating effects is just a little bit better nowadays. True Kings have trap cards which all have floating effects and destroy a monster when they're sent from the field to the graveyard. So if a True King deck uses Heavy Storm, they basically gain the ability to clear out their opponent's entire field. If you wanted to activate There Can Be Only One or Mystic Mind during your opponent's turn, and then turn them off during your turn, you could use Heavy Storm to get rid of those cards while also clearing your opponent's back row. Being able to gain 2 benefits from this card, with one of those beneficial features being incredibly powerful, i.e. clearing out your opponent's entire back row. It's no wonder the card has stayed on the ban list where they've slowly removed Harpy's Feather Duster from it a little bit. Can Heavy Storm be unbanned? Probably not, for the reasons I just described and why it was originally banned. Funny enough, the reason it was originally banned was because of its ability to clear out your opponent's back row, and was thought to be a little bit more balanced because it also cleared yours out. So it was just a staple card that everyone played, and they would try their best to only use it when they didn't have a back row to accidentally destroy the process. Then in the modern game, the reason it wasn't unbanned over Harpy's Feather Duster was because that downside is actually kind of an upside down. So just having 2 positive good effects instead of 1 really good effect. Although, they're not really against having incredibly powerful singular cards that destroy the game, so who knows really. How could they fix Heavy Storm to be unbanned? It's funny that the card was kind of designed in a way so that it wouldn't be broken, and already has negative side effects of destroying your own spell trap cards as well. One of the really good uses of Heavy Storm is the ability to turn off your floodgates. So if they also added a restriction to Heavy Storm when you used it in addition to its current effect, like maybe a Pot of Duality restriction where you can't special summon during the turn you use the effect, that would kind of fix the problem. You would still have the dual nature of being able to destroy your opponent's back row while also setting up your spell and trap cards in the graveyard or turning off a floodgate, but you would be floodgated a little bit until your next turn. And preventing special summons is kind of a catch-all term which affects a lot of decks, so it would only be abusable in very specific types of control decks that probably don't want to destroy their floodgates anyway. Update: all the reasons I mentioned this video years ago are still true. However, I wanted to add more to this. The reason Heavy Storm is so good is because you can sit on floodgates to stop your opponent from playing the game. And since floodgates allow you to control the pace of the game, you have the luxury of waiting to draw into both Heavy Storm and your 1-turn win combo, and using Heavy Storm to clear away your board to pop off. Other strategies don't really allow you to just wait until you eventually draw into your combo. You have to build your deck full of search and draw effects and play through your opponent's disruption to get off that combo. But with floodgates, there's no need to go through that effort. You simply draw into one of your 20 floodgates, stop your opponent from playing the game on your first turn, and simply wait until you draw into Heavy Storm and your other combo pieces eventually. Your combo could simply be something like Cyber Stein and Megamorph for 8,000 piercing damage into Cyber Dragon. It doesn't have to be something good, because you get to control the pace of the game and just clear it when you feel like it, along with anything your opponent might have sent, like their own imperms. Next up, we have Dimension Fusion. This is a spell card that requires you to pay 2,000 life points to activate, and then allows both players to special summon as many of their remove from play monsters as possible. When this card was first released, there wasn't a lot of good ways to remove monsters from play. It required a lot of life points to pay, and also allowed your opponent to special summon cards too, so it wasn't thought of as being that good. It had its moment to shine with an FTK involving Dark Magician of Chaos. Dark Magician of Chaos had the effect that when it was special summoned, you could add a spell card from your graveyard to your hand, and when it left the field, it would banish itself. Cannon Soldier could tribute the card for 500 points of damage, and Spell Economics could allow you to activate spell cards without paying a life point cost. So if you got Cannon Soldier and Dark Magician of Chaos on the field, and you use Cannon Soldier to tribute Dark Magician of Chaos for 500 points of damage, which would then banish the card, then you could activate Dimension Fusion to bring it back, which would allow you to activate its effect to add a Dimension Fusion from your graveyard back to your hand in order to do it all over again. This eventually got Dark Magician of Chaos banned, since Dimension Fusion wasn't thought of as the problem card in that combo. And also, Dark Magician of Chaos was only removed from the ban list because it got an errata, which changed it so it only adds spell cards to your hand during the hand phase. Then, when the Airblade Turbo deck came out, involving Elemental Hero Stratos and Divine Sword Phoenix Blade, they were able to banish a whole bunch of Warrior-type monsters and then bring them back with Dimension Fusion for a whole bunch of advantage. This is what eventually got the card banned in May of 2008. And today, this card would be absolutely broken if it was live, because of just how much better decks have gotten at banishing cards and gaining advantage from it, and how good it would be to bring back 5 of them for the low cost of only 2,000 life points, and no hard once per turns on this card's effect. Being able to resolve a single Dimension Fusion could win you the game in a whole bunch of different kinds of meta decks, which was proven true with cards like Soul Charge, which allows you to bring up to 5 cards from your graveyard, paying up to 5,000 life points, giving up your battle phase, and having a proper once per turn. And Soul Charge was too strong to exist in the metagame. It was eventually banned after hanging out on the ban list at 1 copy for a couple of years. And Dimension Fusion is basically a better version of Soul Charge, which is why it continues to stay banned to this day. Can Dimension Fusion be unbanned in its current form? No. There are decks like Thunder Dragon and Orcus which banish their cards while gaining effect at the same time. And being able to reset all the cards while gaining advantage would generate even more advantage in already inherent +4 that the card already has. The fact that it allows your opponent to summon monsters too is kind of irrelevant, since most decks can easily quell their opponent's field anyway. And Orcus and Thunder Dragons could turn that +4 into a +10 with the amount of extra advantage they could gain from those cards, which is a little bit too broken. And those are probably not even the best examples of decks that could take advantage of Dimension Fusion, although they're pretty good ones anyway. How could Dimension Fusion be fixed to be unbanned? If they lock you out of summoning cards from the extra deck the turn you use the effect, that would definitely help lower the amount of potential advantage you could gain, although you would still have all of the effects that you just reset that were originally banished in order to pay costs and stuff. You would still gain a whole bunch of advantage, and would probably still be too strong even if it had the side effect. So in order to fix it, you'd probably need to slap on a whole bunch of restrictions if you didn't want to give up its original effect. Remember, with this little segment, we're trying to find out how to fix the card. We're not trying to change the effect itself at all, and instead looking for ways to keep the effect intact, while also brainstorming how it could be unbanned for that effect to be balanced. So, if you brought all the cards back, but then banished them face down when they left the field, and also prevented you from special summoning for the rest of the turn, that could be enough to unban the card. If you also slapped on a hard once per turn and no battle phase just like Soul Charge. Although the fact that I feel the need to slap on 4 extra restrictions to make it more balanced should show how powerful the original card is. Next up, we have Metamorphosis. This is another old school spell card, which has the effect where you contribute 1 monster to then special summon 1 fusion monster from your extra deck, just as long as it has the same level of a monster you attributed. This card was a cornerstone in GOAT format, one of the most popular and iconic alternative formats in the game, where they would use Metamorphosis on a Scapegoat token in order to bring out Thousand Eyes Restrict. Although in those same formats, it could also just be used on a Magician of Faith or a Sinister Serpent, and sometimes used on an Air Knight Parshath in order to go Reaper on the Nightmare. Metamorphosis was banned in September of 2007, and with its banning, players could no longer properly summon Elemental Hero Neo Bubble Man. Now, in today's format, Metamorphosis still probably could not be removed from the ban list because of just how many stronger fusion monsters we've gotten over the years. For a couple of examples, we have Blaze Phoenix, the Burning Bombardment Bird, which could potentially be used and abused as Metamorphosis to burn your opponent in some kind of FTK. We have the Last Warrior from Another Planet, which can be used to lock down your opponent from summoning, which is a much bigger deal now than it was when the combo existed back in the day. And also Naturia Exterio, who can lock down your opponent's spell and trap cards and just straight up win you the game against certain decks. Being able to have easy access to the Last Warrior from Another Planet or Naturia Exterio would be a benefit to a whole bunch of meta decks. And this is only surface level stuff. Once pro players actually get their hands on Metamorphosis, I'm sure they find out better ways to break the card than the couple of examples I gave. The ability to cheat fusion monsters out of the extra deck with a somewhat easy to use spell card is kind of strong, as proven by some of the shenanigans you can get into with Cyberstein. Could Metamorphosis be unbanned? The answer is probably not. We currently do have Cyberstein in the game, which allows you to cheat out any fusion monster by just paying 5,000 life points. And while it does see some success, it's not an instant staple like Metamorphosis would be. The difference between the two cards is you have to get Cybersign on the field, and of course pay a substantial amount of life points to use the effect. Whereas Metamorphosis would allow you to trade a monster in you probably brought out there for some kind of combo into just a better Floodgate, like Nature Exterio. The difference between a monster having an effect and a spell or trap card having the effect is like why Cannon Soldier is not banned, but Mass Driver is banned, despite them both having the same effect. Spells and traps with powerful effects are just sometimes easier to use, and ease of use is a very important distinction in how broken a card might become. And Metamorphosis is a very easy to use card, and has a lot of very good targets. But if they banned all those very good targets, or if the metagame got to a point where those very good targets weren't that big of a deal anymore in comparison to just generic Link monsters, for example, then it could probably come off the ban list in this imaginary future, which is not today.